All right, Matt. So I said every the same question, including Jay Shetty, by the way, and you're not going to escape. The question is this: what's a formative decision you've had to make to get to where you are today?
The formative decision or a formative decision?
A formative, but I like the
good.
if you're willing to go there.
Yeah, I'll give you the actually. This is
Okay.
why it's a nuance, right? But and I always say, parents, like, close your ears because you're not going to like this answer to it. But the most important decision I ever made in my life was to drop out of high school.
Mm-hmm.
And if I dissect that decision, sort of everything that came later can be kind of attributed back to that moment on the steps of Cardozo High School when I was 16. So to give you a little bit of context, I grew up very poor in abject poverty in Queens. Those words tend to lose their meaning, right? Abject poverty sounds cliche, but like really poverty. So to sort of paint a picture, like sleeping on a dirty mattress on the floor. A lot of dysfunction, being raised by my mom, who was brilliant but had a lot of health issues, and a lot of hustling since I was a young kid. I used to sell flowers on street corners on holidays, and
Wow.
Mother's Day, I'd be the kid who walk up to people knocking on the windows, like try to guilt the guy into buying flowers, etc. Like I did everything, sold handbags on the top of vans at flea markets. And so just giving you a sense of this constant like hustle, and then a lot of shame, where my mother we'd always take a bus to a food pantry about an hour away. I didn't understand those decisions when I was a kid. Like, were there no food pantries in Bayside, Queens? But we were just trying to hide what we were going through. So a lot of desperation juxtaposed against a mom who was really smart and born of a lot of abuse and left my dad. And I watched as she tried to reclaim some dignity in her life. She got a GED when as an adult, and always felt insecure that she didn't have any education. And she enrolled in Queens College. So imagine my mother cleaning floors for elderly, for senior citizens, making a few bucks an hour, and then at the same time dragging me to classes on Saturday as a 10-year-old boy. So that was my context, was that education was salvation and the place to give my mother dignity. And as I got older, 13, 14, and the contrast between my true life of shame and the one I was pretending to live with my Jordache jeans so kids wouldn't know I was poor became so great that I was like, the world does not work for me. The world is not set up for the edge cases. The world is set up for like a regression to the mean, right? Like, what is the common denominator of experience? And then a world works for them. So what does that mean? Education works for them. But when you're a kid and you're working like at a deli with your butterfly knife so you don't get jumped at 2 a.m. and then trying to go to school, like, it doesn't work. And so I was getting increasingly depressed, hoping a white knight would come. No one ever did. And finally I said, I need to take matters into my own hands. The advice I'm getting from everybody feels completely off kilter with what my intuition is telling me, that I need to make a radical decision. And I came up with a hack. Around 13, 14 years old. If my mother could go to college with a GED as an adult, could I do it on purpose? And if I could do it on purpose, I could pull forward my entire professional career and I could get a job getting paid $9 an hour as a college student. My entire motivation for dropping out of high school was to go from making $5 an hour at a deli to making $9 an hour delivering flyers for a political campaign. That was the epiphany. And I remember my guidance counselor and everyone, when I rolled this decision out, and I wasn't like a ruffian, you know what I mean? I was a decent kid with a good veneer. So it was kind of hard to comport. Like, what do you mean you're going to drop out of high school on purpose? And so I realized that the second decision I made was that the only way for me to actually go forward with this, given the full weight of conventional wisdom and the shame of dropping out, was that I had to torpedo any option to turn back. And so I decided I would fail every single class deliberately, and get left back a few years in a row, sit in the same homeroom with the kids with the beepers, pursuing very different life choices. And I call it the land of misfit toys. They would let me sleep in the back. So I was tired. and then I now to actually execute this decision is an entirely another story. But I ended up going through with it. Last day of high school, returned my textbooks. I remember my science teacher told the whole class, you're what a waste. Higgins, what a waste. And see you at McDonald's. Those were my last words I heard in school. Not to dramatize it, but it's true. Yeah. But he was right, conventionally. I dropped out, took my GED, took my SAT, enrolled in Queens College at 16, and I went to my prom as president of the debate team. And I remember the look in the face of Mr. Rosenthal and the other teachers that went from pity to begrudging admiration, that you had identified a way to make the system work for you. So what do I ascribe to that one decision? One, Warren Buffett talks about compounding. in the context of money, that it's the most important financial principle, which it is. But nobody talks about compounding with professional success, because the same phenomenon is operating upon you. By the single decision to drop out at 16, by the time I was 17, I got a job at a newspaper in Queens called the Tribune in my own column. I became an investigative reporter, writing these muckraking stories as a kid. Well, I came to the attention of Carl Bernstein, who wrote a letter nominating me and my partner for a Pulitzer Prize when I was 19. Now, anybody can be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, but it sure is nice to have that, imprimatur as a kid. And everything kept compounding, so that by the time I went from a 16-year-old kid, I went from a high school dropout. And by the time I was 26, I became the youngest press secretary in New York, going from $375 or $5 an hour to $105,000 a year. So like compounding was how I discovered that sort of exponential compounding applies to professionalism at 16 years old.
Wow. There's a lot in there. And I love the image of you going to school with your mom, because when I was a kid, my mom was going to night school for college. So
really? Oh,
yeah.
so
So she just,
I never had anybody share this with me.
yeah, she's my mom's super intelligent, did great in high school, but just didn't have the, she had to work after she got out of school. She didn't have the ability to like go and off and do 4-year college like a lot of other people. And so when I was a little kid, on the weekends and on the nights, occasionally she would take me to her classes. And there was one time, actually, this is a terrible story, but she took me to class, and the teacher, it was like a kind of a one-on-one session that he was like, whatever, like a study hall kind of thing. And the teacher talked a lot with his hands. And so when we were leaving, the teacher said, "It was very nice to meet you, young man." And I shook my hands up in the air, and I was like, "It was really nice meeting you." And my mom was like, "I'm not going to get an A in that class." So I apologize, Mom. She still did, because she's really good at school. But I love that imagery, because I remember what that was. And it does imbue you with a value. It's like somebody who's an adult who could be just messing around all day is taking their free time to go off and study. And, so it's like, well, there must be something really valuable here. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I love that we're talking. I went back to that college actually and delivered the commencement address. And I start off the speech with the imagery that you and I are talking about. Me sitting on a hot summer day, and I think it was sociology class, and then looking at my mother thinking like, what are we doing here? It's fascinating, right? And that whole imagery. My mom actually, first day I became press secretary. This is the greatest failure of my life. I become press secretary of the mayor of New York at 26. To be honest with you, I wanted nothing to do but to leave that house. Like, I was not a hero. I was desperate to live a normal life. I'm 26 at that point, never even had a girlfriend over, right? Or a single person. So it's like my whole life is constructed on this lie of desperation. And then I get to work that morning at 10 o'clock, and I get a call that she had called an ambulance. And by the time I got there, she had died. Oh. So it was like, for me, it's this never ending life of unfinished business of like, wow. How do I, the shock, being confronted with the fact that we are not guaranteed happy endings is like so horrifying when you actually see it, right? Like, I'd like to put my mother's life in a bow. It's not true. She died in squalor, unable to move and hoping for something better. And so she always was worried her life would have no meaning. And I came up with this idea that I really want to deliver the commencement address and almost inter her here, because it's the only place where she was alive. And I start off the speech with that point, giving context of what she went through to get here, and kind of resurrecting her as a hero to that audience.
Wow. I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that story.
You get so heavy. You brought me back.
Yeah, I know. But the good news is this is such a good sort of wind up for what we're going to talk about, because you talk about the fact, you've got this new book out. It's called Burn the Boats, Toss Plan B Overboard and Unleash Your Full Potential. I like that you kept the boat theme in the subtitle. Very good.
Got to extend the metaphor.
And so this is in your story that you just told about this formative decision. What you really made a point of is that you sort of like, you made sure by failing that it's like you can't just go back. You have closed off the option, the safe plan B, and forced yourself into this thing. It's like, I can't look back, I got to go forward. And so talk about, just to get started here, what is the Burn the Boats philosophy?
Okay, amazing. And again, that is why I did start with that story. But just a quick history lesson on the words "burn the boats." Right. The reason I decided to use that is throughout history. Sometimes it's attributed to Cortez, very bad person, right? But it actually goes back all the way to recorded history. This theme in a military context, when you are outnumbered and your backup is against the wall, the way to win is to eliminate your safety net. And the way to do the boats is your transportation back home, right? So it's in the art of war, it's boats and actually cooking pots. It just shows all the way back to Caesar, the ancient Israelites. Like, anyway, the point is, so I was obsessed with, so they've intuitively understood this notion that the best way to win when the odds are against you is to eliminate your escape route. Let me appropriate that, or misappropriate, and migrate it to a peacetime context, right? Because I believe the same general phenomenon operates upon everybody else. So I set out to try to write the definitive book about how to pursue plan A. Nobody likes to hedge or hesitate, and we convince ourselves it's practical and pragmatic or prudent to do so. But the reality is we don't respect ourselves when we can't cross the threshold of commitment. So one, I set out to establish from a science perspective, which I delve into in the book, history, psychology, why humans perform better when they have no safety net. Because we reflexively recoil when we hear burn the boats, but I gotta pay my bills. And I'm not actually saying, ignore all risk. I'm saying process and synthesize risk so that you can evaluate the worst case scenario and therefore peacefully move forward. And then the second thing I set out to do after establishing that it is in fact true is to demonstrate what it means. What does it actually look like? Using the boat metaphor to make it easy to assimilate, right? What does it mean to go all in on plan A? I use my life as simply a vessel. I think a lot of where these books go wrong is you get so self-aggrandizing. You're like, let me tell you my autobiography. Like, I frankly don't care about my autobiography. If I'm being honest, I'm not interested. What I'm interested is to dissect my decision-making and see if there's anything anyone can learn from it so they can emulate it. So I use myself as a vessel to transmit this idea, but then I interviewed 50 different celebrities, athletes, activists from all strokes, from billionaire Mark Laurie to my partner Scarlett Johansson, to an Olympian who at 14 became a paraplegic and believes her life is better for it. I analyzed all these people to show how they crossed the threshold and see if there are patterns we can discern. And big picture, the two buckets are, what are the internal obstacles that prevent us from moving forward, and what are the external obstacles? Internal being shame, imposter syndrome, all these things, and what do you do about it? And then external obstacles being corporate saboteurs, who in a corporate context are preventing you sort of from making that next move. I tried to use all the trauma and pain and agonizing it took me to get here to discern these patterns that are operating upon us and articulate them in a way that makes them actionable. That was a long sentence, but like that's what I'm trying to do with this book.
I love that. And you start the book with an interesting, very contemporary case study, which is military, by the way, which is Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine. And, because it's interesting, like I was thinking about that when I was reading the intro, and then you pop in Zelensky and I was like, this is, it does go back to like, I've been to like, Central Asia, where the early sort of, these kinds of philosophies played out, were just like, they never had a plan B. They just went in, they would never get, and that's why the Mongols conquered all the way to Cologne, Germany, right? They had a strategy, they had a system, and they also just didn't turn back, right? Unfortunately, they would turn back to like choosing a leader when they died, and that was the whole problem, because they scattered themselves too thin, but we'll not blame them for that. But anyway, how does this
holds true nonetheless? But go ahead, what were you saying?
How does Zelensky fit into what you're talking about in the book?
Sorry, I was saying came by with our new puppy. How does Zelensky? So I think Zelensky is a fascinating character. I mean, we're living through a version of Churchill, right? And since we have low attention span, we've moved on to the next thing. But when we look back in the long arc of history, I mean, this person is obviously Churchillian. But how does he fit in? I opened the book to show that it holds true to present day time. By when everyone thought he was going to capitulate immediately and should capitulate and will be dead immediately, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, offered him basically a way out, and so Zelensky went out there and said, to paraphrase, "I don't need a ride, I need weapons." And I think that when in the long arc of history, when we look back, that is going to be a seminal moment when he signaled to the world, okay, I mean, he may be nuts, but he's going to stay and fight. Maybe we should escalate our commitment. And if you look at that as a turning point, that signaled to everyone else that he had no plan B. It signaled to his own population that they should sort of go all in. But it was the moment when there was a slight pivot. It's the first social media war, right? Where everyone said, this is worth my emotional energy, and it's worth some of my money. And I think that there's a before and an after. And the after was that statement when he said, I'm going to burn the boats.
That's actually really true. And I never thought about connecting that to why everybody got so emotionally invested and financially invested. I mean, I watched The whole thing. I was round the clock sleeping on my couch watching the coverage. I gave money. I went to fundraisers. I did all the things. And I'd been to Ukraine. I liked Ukraine. I believed it was unjust what was happening, but much more than any other conflict that I could think of, because it felt so, you knew he was stuck in and committed in a way that gave you the opportunity to join the fight. How does this
Yeah,
work in the business world?
he's mastered communication in a way that no one else has. In our lifetime, I don't believe at that level, right? To basically, marshal all the resources against the enemy and get people to care about a place they've never been to,
Yeah.
right?
Now, you're an investor in a bunch of amazing companies. Momofuku among them. If RC Ventures, if you go on the portfolio page and look at what you've invested in, it's a bunch of businesses that a lot of us resonate with. Take this burn the boats kind of framework and put it into a business setting where it's not Vladimir Zelensky, but it's a CEO who's got a bunch of employees and investors to deal with.
Yeah, and again, so burn the boats is an umbrella, right? Mm-hmm. To which you can unpack a lot. That and simply meaning, what does it take to fully commit? Yeah. And why I use that umbrella is it enabled me to go to one of the guiding principles of my investing career, which is the fish rots from the head. Right. If you look at what prevents people from fully committing and being successful, it's because there's a misalignment somewhere in their life internally. Usually, I think the greatest arbitrage in society is self-awareness. When we spend all this energy going to Barnes and Noble and searching the bookstores for the outs, and we're looking to outsource our judgment to another. We're always looking for a parental super authority or super ego to tell us what to do. When in reality, the greatest unlock is self-awareness, and the greatest arbitrage is within you. So back to a business context. I touch upon the book, these recurring themes that derail success. One, it starts with shame. A lot of CEOs are humans. They carry baggage, right? So if there's unreconciled shame that makes them afraid of scrutiny because they're hiding something, even from themselves, they're going to be resistant to feedback, right? So if you draw the line between Matt is poor, GD, has shame, feels inadequate, well, reject scrutiny, feedback because I feel like I'm not worthy. I know that sounds like psychobabble, but I'm 100% true. So I start with what are the things in the human that are preventing them from unlocking their full potential and embracing self-awareness. And then that will show up, in how you treat your employees, right? If you deny yourself empathy and the right to acknowledge your pain and trauma, you will deny the same to your employees, right? You will hold them to an impossible standard. And so how does it apply to my investing strategy is I try to create a safe space to have a vulnerable conversation so we can have breakthroughs. And there's a reason why I share. There's a reason why I don't start this podcast by saying I teach at Harvard Business School. To me, I love teaching at Harvard Business School, but it's not useful for creating a safe space to talk about breakthrough. Telling you about my GED and failing to save my mother and carrying that trauma for 25 years is much more useful. And so in my investing, I really try to, as fast as possible, is create a space between myself and my partners, my entrepreneurs about, well, this is what I had to deal with. What do you got? Right. And I find that accelerates the breakthrough. And I tend to lean a lot on industrial psychologists. I've used them for the last, 25 years, which people don't often do. And I think when the worst deals I've ever done is when I've partnered with a private equity shop or like a marquee brand name firm. And I find that all the diligence is numerical. And it's because we want certainty. We want to reduce everything to an Excel sheet, but the Excel sheet doesn't have the answers. The human does, right? So I spend a lot of time just trying to, create that space where we can have breakthroughs. And not everybody, maybe I have a bias because I had issues I needed to work through, but I kind of feel like everybody carries something. At any one point in time, what percentage of the population is going through divorce and trying to save their marriage, right? Like we're all carrying something. So I really try to take these sunny Instagram posts of like failure is a great thing and turn it into something actionable. You know what I mean? Like there's like superficial layer of the universe and actually make it concrete.
I want to repeat back to you what you said because I don't usually do this, by the way. I wrote this down. This is going into my list. I have a list on my phone of what I call just like great thoughts, and you're getting on there today, which is
I'm being honest. Like honest, that's all I'm here to do.
Oh no, I'm not here to tell you you're great. I just want to repeat your quote because I loved it. The greatest unlock in life is self-awareness, and the greatest arbitrage is within you. When you said that, I had like 43 examples of things that I've seen around me of people who have struggled and failed for that precise reason. Because, and by the way, didn't have investors that would challenge them, didn't have employees who would step up to them. Like that's where leaders fail too. But it's like, if you were moderately self-aware, insert name here, and there's a bunch of us, a bunch of names we can put in there, Elon Musk, among others. Sorry, Elon, but I just got to do that. Imagine, yeah, the guy's been successful, but like it's all going up in smoke in a lot of ways because of the lack of self-awareness. And it happens over and over again. So that's a really, we can all do that. You don't need to go to Harvard Business School. You don't need to be rich. I mean, these are things that, in fact, some people who have the least resources do these things incredibly well vis-a-vis other people because they don't have all the noise and distraction around them.
Well, let's talk about that. So let's make it actually more practical from an investment standpoint. Because so now we're in the empathy, in the psychobabble. Let's make it like, mercenary black and white from an investor standpoint. Why is backing people with high self-awareness more effective? And the reason is self-awareness. People who over-index for self-awareness do not require interventions to make course corrections. It scales better. So if I'm backing somebody who's self-aware, rather than me having to have that frictionful conversation of saying, well, Bob, turns out you're really a shitty manager, and maybe you weren't cut out to be the COO. Maybe you were cut out to be the chief revenue officer, or whatever. If somebody's over-indexed for self-awareness, they are intellectually curious about the areas where they need to be buttressed, and they will make their own course corrections. I always say, again, not to make snap judgments, but I generally can predict the ultimate success of a founder CEO based upon how long it takes them to implement a decision that is objectively inevitable. Your product is going to fail. You're whatever, right? That toxic employee is going to kill your company. But there's a certain type of individual who under-indexes for self-awareness that needs to see the iceberg port side before they'll actually make the decision. So I put so much energy, but the problem is these are abstract thoughts, which is why I wrote my book. Like, the abstract layer is where the real opportunity is, but somebody needs to articulate it in a way that can be assimilated, right? So I was like, how do I take that idea of self-awareness and try to make it something that all of us who are listening to this can spot outside of us and spot within us, right? Like, how do you identify somebody who over-indexes for self-awareness? What does it look like? And I try to reduce it to something that we all can understand.
So let's go there. Let's talk about, I have to imagine, and by the way, I don't want to pick on HBS because it's a great place, but having been there, like, and also, but coming from the state of Maine in a middle-class family. And so I didn't have the Hamptons house and all the things that a lot of my classmates had, or the dad who was the prime minister or whatever, or mother. The level of self-awareness for some people who have a gazillion plan Bs, and if they fail, they always have a slot at the family conglomerate and stuff like that. Vis-a-vis the scrappy person who just had they're like, I have one option only, which is just like, I got to figure this out because that's all there is for me. It is, it's interesting to think about that dichotomy. How does one, take a person who grows up with all of the plan Bs in the world and no need to be self-aware because they've got all the credentials? Like, how do you move them into the space where they are self-aware? Is it some people are just born like that, or is it a learned skill?
I think that if you under-index for self-awareness, the best way to have a breakthrough is to model it, because the soul can recognize the peace that comes from letting go. But I think every single person, unless you're a sociopath, which is about 1% to 2%, will identify when they see it modeled and will want to emulate it, right? Because it's a better place to live. That's my short answer. That's generally been my hack. I'm not doing it to be manipulative. I'm doing it because I really care. I've for better or worse, tortured by empathy. So if I see something, I'm like, wow, if you only you would let go, and then you do it. Now I find those who don't want to emulate it tend to be narcissistic, frankly, right? So maybe not a sociopath, but they tend to be narcissistic and they reject it, right? But most people are not. They want to live that way.
And so if you're a leader or you're an investor and you have that person who's just, you sit them down in a room, they're failing on that front, like, what do you say to them?
I think those people respond to consequence more than anything. If you don't, you're saying if they under-index for self-awareness and we don't think they're coachable and not responding.
Yeah, and you just see they're failing. Like, you're the investor, you've invested this person, like you thought you had the right read on them, but then once you get into the business and you watch the way they're leading the business, they're just missing it all, and you see that they're failing, and you're like, this is my chance. Like, I got to step in now. I got to work with them. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's where the energy drain comes from, right? Because you spend a lot of time hoping that you can move people along. It's very difficult. But I think that you then have to pivot your energy from empathy towards the person to empathy towards the job dependencies, right? This person will be unsuccessful. Forget about the money that will be lost, but these lives will be disrupted. Usually when somebody is manifesting that way, there's an element of persecution, is right. There's a victim involved, and the victim is the ones who are depending upon that person for leadership and for their jobs to feed their children. And so I think you shift motivation systems from trying to unlock the best of that person to preserving the best of the people who are dependent upon that person, and you make very harsh decisions as fast as humanly possible, frankly. But it's very hard to know when's the moment, right? But I think we all know when we have somebody who's very help resistant and change resistant because they're narcissistic and it's hard to break through, right? Like we all can identify it after a period of reps. Most people are not, though. Most people feel a sense of relief when you identify that this is where you're falling short. And by the way, it's not the end of the world, right? Because when we're not self-aware, you also catastrophize about the consequence of self-awareness. That's the big block. It's either you got daddy issues or something. I'm unloved, like I'm going to lose everything I ever got. There's usually a block. And if you relieve them of the consequence of that and say, it's still okay. I talk about this in my book. My greatest case study was one of my CEOs. This is exactly the fact pattern. I break down some of the archetypes of failed leadership and put words to concepts. One of them is, martyr. And the martyr is the leader who believes that they, are going to take everything on because that is the universe's preordained, that they must carry the load, right? And the problem with the martyr is they take on too much and they block other people from actually doing the job, and they're mediocre by definition because they're doing too much, right? So I had one of my CEOs who was a martyr and trying to break down like, well, why are you a martyr? And it's because he was defining the job incorrectly. He thought the job of a founder and a CEO was to be good at everything, as opposed to identify others who are good at everything and better than him, to almost render yourself obsolete in most areas where you're not critical. And then the company was about to fall apart, like literally. And he called me up one night and he was crying on the phone. And I said, what's going on? I said, I failed you. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I'm gonna quit. And then I was like, what's the beeping noise that I hear in the background? He's like, I'm in the hospital. My daughter has a lot of health issues. She's tied up to an EKG wrapped around her head. And I was like, first of all, hang up the effing phone. I was like, you are struggling. You've been carrying too much. We need a reset. You hang up. Call me whenever you come up for air again. The job will still be here. I will let you know when you're finished. I will have no problem making this phone call, but it'll be my call to make. And, he called me several days later and he's like, okay, I'm ready to go to work. We brought in an industrial psychologist, started coaching him. She actually came back like, man, this place is, rough. There's all these issues. We did this report and it was one of the most uncomfortable professional meetings I ever had. My process is the person gets the report and they don't have to show it to me. Like literally, the mere act of doing the report is enough of a process. And he presented the findings to me in such an uncomfortable way. And then he excused himself from the room. And then he went into his team meeting next door and he dropped the report in the center of the table and said, you already know everything that I've got going wrong. And I got a lot of work to do. Why don't we start here? And you can pass it around, and had everybody read it. 20 months later, he sold the company for well north of $100 million. He had taken something that was destined to be a zero and changed the course of his life and his kid's life. And I knew he had it in him anyway, but all he needed was the breakthrough. There's a personal layer of stuff that even I to this day don't know what it was that was really making him stuck. And so that is a triumphant case study that I get into the book. But, I obviously have several times when the leader was completely resistant to that process and they failed.
The greatest unlock in life is self-awareness, and the greatest arbitrage is within you. You got to say it again because that's your story right there. That tells the tale right there.
Still a work in progress, by the way. And I don't say that in a cliche way.
Matt, where should I send people? By the way, I forgot to ask you this earlier.
Well, that's great.
Yeah. What's your like one or two places so we don't?
I love to go to LinkedIn is where I spend a lot of my time. I find it to be a warm bath.
Are you just Matt Higgins on there?
Yeah, Matt Higgins on LinkedIn. My book is Burn the Boats. You can go to burntheboatsbook.com. Obviously, available on Amazon and all over America.
Yeah.
But honored for anyone who takes the time to read it. Please let me know what you think.
Okay, let me do this. I'm going to read it and then we'll just do the end. So, okay, everybody, the book is Burn the Boats. You can find out more about Matt if you go to LinkedIn, where he's Matt Higgins. You can also go to burntheboatbook.com. Which is interesting because it's amazing that burntheboat.com is already taken, but that just...
I know it's an advertising firm. I was like, I really wanted it.
Yeah, so go check that out. Go find the book on Amazon and let Matt know what you think about the book. Matt Higgins, author of Burn the Boat. Thanks for being here.
Patrick, you're amazing. Thank you.